I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Put down your phone, close that other tab, set aside whatever it is you think matters more than this. Because I'm about to tell you about the night a king made the worst decision in 5,000 years of recorded history, and he made it in front of witnesses. He made it in front of me. And the thing is, I wasn't even supposed to be there. I was a technician, a systems analyst embedded with the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, stationed at the northern citadel of Varenthos as part of what my department called a routine cultural interface assignment. That's the official language. What it actually meant was that I was there to make sure the holographic translation arrays didn't glitch during the treaty negotiations, and that nobody accidentally insulted anyone due to a bad firmware update. That was my job. That was all I was supposed to do. I was not supposed to witness the unraveling of a 5th-century dynasty. But that's what happened, and I've been sitting on this story for 3 years now, going back and forth on whether to tell it, because every time I open the file I kept, every time I look at my own handwritten notes from that night, the timestamps, the environmental readings, the fragments of conversation I managed to capture on my personal recorder, I feel that same thing I felt standing in that corridor. That cold, sinking, hollow feeling of watching someone destroy something irreplaceable and not being able to stop them. So here it is, all of it. The night Kedron Vorath, king of the eternal bloodline, stood in his own throne room and said words he could never take back. And she walked away carrying something he didn't even know existed. Set up the world of VARNTHOS. Let me paint you the picture first, because if you don't understand where we were, none of what follows will land the way it should. Varenthos is not a planet in the way Earth people typically imagine planets. It doesn't have a single sun, doesn't rotate in a clean ellipse, doesn't have seasons the way we do. It orbits a binary star system, one white dwarf called Sarath, and one dying red giant called Mervhan. And the light those two stars produce together creates something that defies easy description. During what the Varenthi call the dusk merge, which happens roughly every 40 hours, the sky turns this deep bruised violet color, layered with streaks of amber where the two light sources bleed into each other. It looks like a wound healing in slow motion. It looks like something ancient trying to close itself. The citadel sits at the northern pole of the planet's largest landmass, built into the face of a mountain range that has no name in any human language. The Varenthi call it Koreth Nahel, which translates roughly to the spine of what remains. The citadel itself is a structure of black stone and something the locals call drevite, a naturally occurring mineral that absorbs light and re-emits it at a different frequency, so the walls of the citadel always seem to glow faintly from within. Not warm, not welcoming, more like the glow of something radioactive, more like something that has swallowed too much of the world and can't quite contain it anymore. I arrived 3 weeks before the summit was scheduled to begin. My deployment team was 7 people, myself, 2 field linguists, a security consultant named Priya who had done 3 prior deployments to Varenthos, and whose comm I deeply envied, a hardware specialist, a medical officer and our team lead, a man named Commander Brecht who had the kind of permanent tired expression that comes from spending 20 years negotiating between species who have no particular reason to trust each other. The Varenthi are vampiric in nature. I want to be careful here, because there's a tendency when humans talk about vampiric species to fall into Earth fiction tropes, capes, coffins, garlic, whatever. None of that applies. The Varenthi are an ancient humanoid species that evolved with a metabolic dependency on hemogenic compounds found in the blood of other living beings. Thousands of years ago, they developed synthetic alternatives, called Vistine, that made the predatory aspect of their biology largely obsolete in practice. Most modern Varenthi have never fed directly from a living creature. It's culturally taboo, actually, in most sectors of their society. It carries roughly the same social weight on Varenthos as cannibalism carries on Earth. But they are old, extraordinarily old. The eldest among them, the royal bloodlines, the ancient families, have been alive for millennia, and that kind of age changes a being in ways that are difficult to articulate. It changes how they move. It changes how they speak. There's a slowness to them that isn't laziness or lethargy. It's more like they've learned that time is not the resource most beings think it is. It's more like they've stopped reacting to things and started simply witnessing them. Kedron Vorath was 4,087 years old. I know that number because his official biography was in our diplomatic briefing packet, and I'd read it 3 times on the transit shuttle because I had nothing else to do, and anxiety is a great motivator for excessive research. 4,087 years. That's longer than human recorded history. That's longer than the Egyptian pyramids have been standing. And he'd spent the last 5 centuries of that life ruling the northern bloodline territories, a region encompassing roughly a third of Varanthos's habitable surface area, 4 moons, and 17 dependent colonies spread across 2 star systems. He was not a small power. And she, Lyrineth, the queen consort, had been at his side for 312 of those 500 years. I want you to understand the weight of that number too. 312 years. Not a political marriage that soured after a decade. Not a relationship that faded with familiarity after a few generations. 3 centuries of shared rule, shared decisions, shared history. She had stood beside him through 2 succession crises. A civil war, the Mervhan Plague of 1847 by Galactic Standard Calendar, and the integration of the dependent colonies into the Greater Varanthi Compact. She had been his partner in governance, his co-signatory on every major treaty, his voice in the council chambers when his own voice had grown too weary to argue. 312 years. And then, in the space of approximately 4 minutes, he ended all of it. I need to explain how I ended up in the inner corridor that night, because it matters for context. The summit negotiations had hit a wall which was not unusual in my experience. Negotiations always hit walls. The question is always whether the wall is load-bearing or decorative, and determining that takes time. In this case, the wall was a territorial dispute over the second moon of Varanthos's 4th orbital body, which had recently been found to contain deposits of something called veritine, a compound that the Galactic Medical Consortium wanted very badly for synthesizing a new generation of hemogenic treatments, and which the Varanthi Crown considered sovereign property. Commander Brecht had suggested a 48-hour recess to allow both sides to consult with their respective legal teams. The Varanthi delegation had agreed, and I, having completed my systems check for the day and finding myself with an unexpected pocket of free time, had decided to take a walk. The Citadel was not off-limits to diplomatic personnel. We'd been given what our briefing called supervised access to most of the public areas, the grand corridors, the observatory on the 4th tier, the garden terraces on the south face. I had my access badge. I had my recorder, which I always carried because I'm the kind of person who records ambient sound in interesting places. I was not doing anything wrong. What I was doing was taking a wrong turn. The Citadel's internal layout is not intuitive for human spatial reasoning. The Varanthi don't experience architecture the way we do. They navigate partly by pressure sense, partly by what the diplomatic linguists called resonance memory, which means they recall spaces through a kind of somatic imprint rather than visual landmarks. The result is that the corridors in the intersections of the Citadel branch and curve in ways that make no visual sense, because they were designed for beings who don't need to see them to know where they are. I turned left where I should have turned right, followed a corridor that curved gradually downward, and found myself in a passage that was significantly colder than the public areas and significantly darker, lit only by the faint drevite glow of the walls and a series of recessed fixtures that emitted light at the very edge of the human visible spectrum. I knew I was somewhere I probably shouldn't be. I also knew the fastest way to make a situation worse is to panic, so I stopped, pulled out my recorder, opened the mapping function, and started trying to orient myself. That was when I heard the voices. Build tension. The first thing I noticed was that the voices were coming from behind a door that was not fully closed. Not open, just not closed. There was a gap of maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, and through that gap came light and sound, and the kind of charged atmospheric weight that a room carries when something very serious is happening inside it. I should have backed away immediately. I know that. I know it even as I'm telling you this. But here's the honest truth about that moment. The voices were speaking in Varenthi Standard, and my translation earpiece was still active, and the first phrase I caught stopped me dead in my tracks. The phrase was, "You were supposed to be eternal." And even through the flat, mechanical filter of my translation software, even rendered into English by an algorithm, there was something in that sentence that physically stopped me moving, because it wasn't said in anger. It was said in exhaustion. It was said by someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had just decided to put it down, not gently, but simply, with the weariness of someone who doesn't have the strength for ceremony. I stood in that corridor and I didn't move. I want to be clear, I'm not proud of what I did next. I didn't announce myself. I didn't back away. I pressed myself against the wall of that corridor in the dark and I listened. And my recorder, which I hadn't switched off, was still running. The voice I'd heard first was his, Kedron Vorath. I recognized it from the formal sessions, deeper than you'd expect, with a particular cadence that the translation software sometimes struggled with, a rhythm that was older than the standard dialect and bled through in moments of emotional intensity. The other voice was hers. I had heard Lyrineth speak twice in formal settings, once at the opening ceremony of the summit, where she delivered a welcome address in 3 languages, and once during a brief corridor encounter where she had nodded at our team and said something polite about the translation work. Both times I'd been struck by the quality of her presence. Not her appearance, though she was striking in the way all elder Varenthi are striking, with that particular quality of stillness that reads as either profound calm or profound grief depending on your angle. What struck me was her weight, not physical weight, the weight of someone who has been somewhere long enough to understand it completely and has chosen to stay anyway. Her voice through the gap in the door was quieter than his, but it was also steadier. Let me tell you what I understood of that conversation. And then let me tell you what I didn't understand, which is the part that matters. He had been talking for some time before I arrived in that corridor. That much was clear from the fact that the conversation already had momentum, already had that particular texture of an argument that has moved past its opening positions and into the raw material underneath. I came in somewhere in the middle, which means I'm missing context. I've thought about that a lot in the 3 years since. I've wondered what the beginning looked like, what the first words were, what took them from wherever their evening started to that room with that gap in the door, and that quality of finality in the air. What I heard was this. He said, "I have given you everything. I have given you 3 centuries of loyalty, 3 centuries of my name, 3 centuries of the bloodline's trust extended to you by my hand alone. And you have spent the last of them betraying everything I built." There was a pause, not a short one, long enough that I started to wonder if she'd left the room somehow without my hearing it. And then, "I haven't betrayed anything." Her voice, steady, no heat in it at all, which somehow made it more significant, not less. Like the kind of calm you develop when you've already decided something, and the deciding was the hardest part, and now you're just on the other side of it. You attended the Compact Council session without my authorization. You gave testimony about the Veritine deposits without consulting me. You spoke to the Galactic envoys as though you had independent standing in this negotiation, as though you were not my consort but a sovereign in your own right. I gave testimony because I was asked for it, because the compact envoys asked me directly, in formal session, and refusing to answer would have been a diplomatic incident. You should have referred them to me. I tried. Your Chamberlain said you were unavailable. Another pause, shorter this time. That is not the point. Then tell me what the point is. I pressed a little closer to the wall. I don't know why. She'd asked the question so simply, without accusation, without challenge, just a genuine request for clarity. Tell me what the point is. Like someone who has asked this question before, and is genuinely still waiting for a coherent answer. He said, the point is that there is an order to things. There has always been an order to things. I am the king. I speak for the bloodline. You stand beside me, you support, you advise, you represent, but you do not act independently. You do not make decisions that belong to the throne. That is the order. That is what you agreed to when you took this position. I agreed to it 300 years ago. And I am not the same person I was 300 years ago, and you are not the same king, and the world is not the same world. There was a change in the sound then. A kind of stillness that was different from the previous pauses, more charged, like the air before lightning. And his voice, when it came again, was different too, quieter, which somehow made it feel larger. No, I suppose it isn't. Then I have been patient, Lyrineth. I have been more patient with you than I have been with anyone in 4,000 years of living. I have accommodated your counsel. I have elevated you beyond your station. I have given you a name that wasn't yours and a seat at a table that wasn't built for you. And still you push. Still you reach beyond what you were given. I don't know what else you want from me. And she said quietly, still quietly, but with something underneath the quiet now, something that had been held for a long time and was finally just barely surfacing. I want you to remember that I am not something you gave. I am not an accommodation. I am not a seat at a table that you graciously offered me. I have earned every decision I've made. I have spent 3 centuries earning it. And if that's not something you can see, if after everything, you still only see me as an extension of your authority, then we've had a very different 300 years. Silence. And then, and this is the part that I will hear for the rest of my life, the part I have replayed on that recording more times than I want to admit, he said. Then we have. Because the queen I chose would not have undermined me. The queen I chose would have understood her place. You are no longer the queen I chose. A beat. One more beat. You are no longer my queen. Climax. I want to tell you about the technology in that room, because this is where the science fiction element of this story becomes impossible to ignore, and I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to weave it in without it sounding clinical. The citadel of Varenthos has what the Varenthi architects call a thrumline, a network of environmental resonance sensors embedded in the walls that monitor and respond to the emotional and physiological states of the building's occupants. It's not AI in the way we'd recognize it. It's more like the building has a nervous system, one that evolved alongside the people who built it, calibrated specifically to Varenthi biology. When a Varenthi elder experiences extreme emotional stress, and I mean extreme, not the ordinary wear of daily frustration, but the kind of deep systemic stress that comes from existential threat or profound shock, the thrumline responds. The walls shift their emission frequency. The ambient temperature changes. If the stress is severe enough, there's an audible resonance, a low, almost subsonic hum that the walls produce, like the citadel itself is vibrating in sympathy. When Kedron Voreth said those words, the thrumline activated. I felt it through the soles of my boots. I felt it through my sternum. My translation earpiece generated a brief interference burst, a sign that the ambient frequency had spiked enough to affect the signal processing, and then recalibrated. and the walls of that corridor around me began to glow differently, not the usual faint inner light of the Drevite, brighter, redder, like something heating up from the inside. I later learned, from the Varenthi technical staff who had to file an incident report about the thrumline irregularity, that the activation that night registered at the 7th level of the 9-level scale. The last time a 7th level activation had been recorded was during the Mervhan Plague of 1847, when 300 people died in the Citadel in a single night. It wasn't just him, I think, that triggered it. I think it was her response. She didn't cry. I want to be very clear about that. Not because I think crying would have been weakness. It wouldn't have been, not in any world I care to live in, but because her not crying was significant in a very specific way. It was the response of someone who had already done the crying, who had already sat with this particular grief in private, in the hours or days or weeks before this moment, and had arrived at this conversation having already processed enough of it to be still. She said, "All right." 2 words, nothing else. Not "how could you," not "after everything," not "you don't mean that," just "all right." And then she said, "I'll need 3 days to arrange my departure." And he said, and I could hear something shift in his voice, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the first crack of uncertainty, "You don't have to leave the Citadel." "Yes, I do. You just told me what I am to you. I can't stay somewhere I'm not what I thought I was." A pause. "Where will you go?" "I don't think that's your concern anymore." Silence, long silence, and then, "Lyrineth." "Good night, Kedron." I heard movement. I heard the particular sound of Varenthi formal robes shifting, which is different from human fabric. There's a faint metallic undertone to the synthetic fibers they use, and it makes a sound when it moves that's almost like very quiet chimes. I heard that sound moving toward the door, and I had approximately 2 seconds to decide what to do. I did the only sensible thing. I backed up fast into the curve of the corridor, pressed myself into the shadow of a recessed alcove, and held completely still. The door opened, and Lyrineth, queen consort of the northern bloodline territories, stepped into the corridor. She didn't see me at first. She stood in the corridor with her back to the partially open door, and she stopped, not dramatically, not in the way of a person performing their grief for an audience. She stopped the way you stop when you've been holding your breath for too long and your body finally just makes you. One long, slow exhalation. Her shoulders dropped fractionally from a position they'd clearly been holding for some time. Her chin dropped slightly too, and she looked at the floor of the corridor for a moment. Just the floor, just the dark stone, as if she was very tired and the floor was where she decided to put that tiredness down. Then she straightened. It happened so quickly I almost missed it. One moment she was just a person standing in a corridor at the end of something terrible. The next, she was herself, whatever that self was. Whatever 3 centuries of learning to hold power had built into her spine and her jaw and the set of her shoulders. She was herself again, and she turned and she saw me. I would like to tell you I handled the moment gracefully. I did not. I said, "I'm sorry I got lost. I have my badge. I wasn't trying to." She held up one hand. Just one hand, just a small gesture, and I stopped talking. She looked at me for a long moment. The translator in my earpiece was doing its job. I could see the tiny light on the side that tells you it's processing, but her expression wasn't something any algorithm could decode. It was a very complex expression. There was exhaustion in it. There was something that might have been the very edge of dark humor. And there was, underneath both of those, something I couldn't name then and have only found a word for recently. Purposefulness. She said in flawless Galactic standard, which I hadn't known she spoke that fluently, "You're with the diplomatic team." "Systems technician," I said. "Translation arrays, holographic interface." "Did you hear that conversation?" I want to tell you I lied, but she was looking at me with 400 years of accumulated ability to read people, and I'd like to think I'm a reasonable judge of when a lie is going to make things worse. Some of it, I said. I wasn't trying to. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said something I have thought about constantly for 3 years. Good, then you'll be able to tell people what really happened when the time comes. She said it quietly, not urgently, not with the tone of someone issuing a directive, more with the tone of someone making a small, practical note, like reminding themselves to pick up supplies before a long journey. And then she said, "Which way is the south corridor from here? I keep forgetting this wing doesn't follow the standard grid." I pointed. She thanked me formally, with the correct Varenthi courtesy gesture that my briefing materials had spent 2 pages on, and she walked away, her formal robes making that quiet sound of almost chimes, and she turned the corner, and she was gone. I stood in that corridor for a very long time after she left. And then I went back to my quarters and I wrote down everything I remembered, word for word, before the details could blur. Resolution Part 1. 3 days passed. They were the strangest 3 days I've spent in 20 years of diplomatic deployments, and that's saying something, because I once spent a week on a station where the gravity generators were malfunctioning, and everyone had to walk at a 15-degree tilt. The summit negotiations resumed. Commander Brecht managed to restart the talks with what I can only describe as professional heroism. The man has the diplomatic patience of a geological formation. The Varenthi delegation returned to the table, full complement, and to outward appearances nothing had changed. But something had changed. I could feel it, though I couldn't have articulated it at the time, and I'm still not sure I can articulate it perfectly now. The Varenthi are not an expressive species in the human sense. They don't do the things that humans do when we know something is wrong. The nervous energy, the averted glances, the hushed conversations that stop when someone new enters the room. They're too old for most of those tells. They've learned to contain things. But there was something in the air of the Citadel during those 3 days that was different. Something in the thrumline, I think, though I couldn't have named it that at the time. The walls seemed to hum at a slightly different frequency. The ambient light in the public corridors felt slightly different, not dimmer exactly, but colder, like the building was conserving something. And King Kedron Vorath, at the negotiating table, was not quite himself. I watched him carefully during those sessions because I was there, because I was paying attention, because I'd heard what I'd heard and I couldn't unhear it. He was as precise as always, as measured as always, every word placed with the deliberate weight of someone who has been doing this for centuries. But there was something behind it that I can only describe as a very slight displacement. Like a machine that's been perfectly calibrated its entire life, and has developed a very small vibration that isn't hurting anything yet, but tells you something has shifted somewhere inside. He knew she was leaving. I think he knew it from the moment she said all right. I think that was what he was living with during those 3 days, not regret exactly. He's too old for quick regret, the kind that comes right after, but something else. The knowledge of a decision made, the weight of something set into motion. On the morning of the 4th day, I was at my station in the translation array control room when Priya, my security consultant colleague, appeared in the doorway with her coffee, and the expression she reserved for significant developments. She said, "The Queen Consort is gone." I looked up from my screen. She left at 300, private transport, 1 aide, no ceremony. Where? They're not saying. The official statement from the Palace Communications Office is personal retreat for health reasons. I turned back to my screen and I said nothing. Priya was quiet for a moment then. "The whole place feels different, have you noticed? Like something structural got removed." "Yeah," I said, "I noticed. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. I know it because of sources I'm not at liberty to fully identify, and because of a report that crossed my desk 14 months after that summit, classified at a level I probably shouldn't have had access to, and which I read in its entirety sitting in a transit lounge on Meridian Station, unable to move for the better part of an hour after I finished it. Lyrineth was pregnant when she left. She had known for approximately 6 weeks before the night in that room with the gap in the door. She had not told him. The report doesn't explain exactly why, doesn't have the granularity for that, but I've had 3 years to think about it, and I think I understand it. In Varanthi biology, pregnancy is extraordinarily rare. I mean extraordinarily, vanishingly, almost mythologically rare. The Varanthi are essentially immortal. They don't die of disease, don't die of age, can sustain wounds that would kill most species and recover from them. Their reproductive biology evolved in tandem with their longevity in a way that makes intuitive evolutionary sense. If you're going to live essentially forever, you don't need to reproduce often, and the biological apparatus for it reflects that. A Varanthi pregnancy is something that happens perhaps once in a century for the most fertile of bloodlines, and often not at all. The king's bloodline, the Vorath line, had not produced an heir in 270 years. There is a word in Varanthi cultural lexicon that doesn't translate perfectly into any galactic standard language. The closest approximation is Kethvaral. It means something like the one who continues, the one who makes the line go forward. The heir that an ancient bloodline waits for across the centuries, not as a political successor, but as something almost sacred. A confirmation that the line is not finished, that the story isn't over, that everything that was built across the millennia has somewhere to go. The Varanthi healers who had confirmed Lyrineth's condition, quietly, discreetly, during a routine health assessment, had used the word Kethvaral in their notes. She had read those notes. She had understood what they meant, and she had spent 6 weeks trying to decide what to do with the information. And then, before she decided, the night in that room had happened. "You are no longer my queen." He'd said it not knowing. He'd sent her away not knowing. And she had walked out of that citadel carrying the heir he had been waiting 270 years for, and she had said nothing. I've thought about why she said nothing in the corridor after when she saw me, when she chose to speak to me, a stranger, a technician who'd overheard something she should never have overheard. She could have told me. She could have said, "Tell them when you talk to your people that I left because I had no other choice. Tell them what you heard." She could have made it about the injustice of it, the magnitude of what was being done to her. She didn't. She said, "Tell people what really happened," not what was done to her. What really happened. Like she already knew there was going to be a version that wasn't the truth, and she wanted a witness to the actual thing. And then she asked me for directions. Because she had somewhere to go, and she needed to get there, and whatever she was carrying inside her was more important than anything else in that corridor. That's the kind of woman she was. That's the kind of queen she still was, whether he declared it or not. The last entry in my journal from that deployment reads, "The king built something that lasted 5 centuries. Tonight I watched him decide it was finished, and I think he was the only one in the building who believed it." 14 months later. That's how long it took for the story to find its way back. Not through official channels, not through a diplomatic briefing or an intelligence report or a formal communique from the Varanthi throne. Through a message, sent to my personal account on an encrypted channel I hadn't used in years, from a source identification code I didn't recognize. The message was 4 sentences long. It said, "You were at the Citadel 14 months ago. You were in the North Corridor. You have a recording. I need to speak with you. LV." LV. Lyrineth Vorath. She had kept her name. The coordinates she sent me were for a station I'd never heard of, in a system so far from the Varanthi territories that it didn't appear on any of my standard navigation charts. I had to pull a specialist mapping database to find it, One of those deep archive cartographic resources that catalogs installations too small or too remote to appear on mainstream systems. The station was called HFY 7. It had been built 60 years ago as a research outpost for a xenobiological survey team, decommissioned when the survey concluded, and apparently reactivated, quietly, without any formal registration update in the Galactic Infrastructure Index, about 15 months ago. About a month before Lyrinith left the Citadel. I'm not a field agent. I'm a systems technician. I have no training in the kind of situation assessment that would tell me whether responding to that message was wise. But I'm also the person who stood in a corridor and heard what I heard, and I made a promise, implicitly, when I wrote down every word I could remember and saved that recording. I promised to be the witness she'd asked me to be. So I went. The transit took 11 days, including a layover on a hub station where I spent most of my time drinking bad synthetic coffee and rereading my notes from that original deployment. I also, during those 11 days, finally listened to the full recording on my personal device. All of it. I'd been avoiding it, I realized, saving it but not listening to it. Which is a very human thing to do with things that are heavy. You carry them, but you don't open them. Listening to it with 11 months of distance was different from being in that corridor. I could hear things I hadn't heard in the moment. Small things, the quality of the pauses, the way her voice shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, when he said you have given you a name that wasn't yours, like something in that particular phrase required an extra beat of processing, like it landed differently than the rest. I could also hear something I hadn't noticed at all in the moment. Just before she stepped out of the room, in the last second before the door opened, there was a sound that I'd initially registered as nothing significant. But listening again, carefully, I realized it was breathing. A very specific pattern of breathing, controlled, deliberate, the kind you do when you're managing something physical. The kind that my medical officer colleague, when I described it to her afterward without context, said sounded like someone in the early stages of pregnancy managing nausea during a stressful moment. She'd been managing that in there. While he was saying those words, she'd been managing the physical reality of the thing she was carrying and the emotional reality of the thing she was losing simultaneously, and she had been still. HFY 7 was smaller than I'd imagined from the coordinates. Most of these old research outposts they're built for function rather than scale, optimized for whatever the survey work required and nothing beyond that. This one had clearly been modified since its original decommission. The external docking assembly was newer than anything else on the station's exterior, and equipped with security protocols I hadn't seen since my one and only deployment to a galactic military installation. A person met me at the dock, not Varenthi. Human, actually, which surprised me. Young, maybe mid-20s, with the particular efficiency of movement that comes from specific training. She introduced herself as Myra and said nothing else informative, just led me through 2 security checkpoints and down a corridor that smelled of recycled air and something organic I couldn't identify. The room she brought me to was small, but it had been furnished with the kind of care that happens when someone is trying to make a utilitarian space feel livable. There were textiles on the walls, actual physical textiles, not projections, in colors that I recognized from the Varenthi decorative tradition, deep purples and golds and that specific shade of black-green that their formal drapery tends toward. There were books. Physical books, which are an eccentric choice in an age of universal data access, but which make a very particular kind of sense for someone who might be in a place without guaranteed network connectivity. And there was light, warmer than the Citadel's light, deliberately warmer, adjusted to something closer to human comfortable rather than the cool blue-white spectrum the Varenthi generally prefer. Someone had made this place theirs. Lyrinith came in from a side door, and for a moment I had the startling experience of not recognizing her. Not because she'd changed dramatically. She hadn't, in the physical sense. The Varenthi elder appearance doesn't shift quickly enough for 14 months to make a visible difference. She was the same she was in the corridor of the Citadel. That same stillness, that same quality of presence, that particular characteristic of Elder Varenthi, where they seem to take up exactly as much space as they intend to, and not one atom more. What had changed was the context around her. At the Citadel, even in that corridor at the end of something terrible, she had existed in relation to the institution. You could feel it, the centuries of it, the weight of the throne and the bloodline and the name and the position. She had been Lyrineth Vorath, queen consort, even when she was just a person standing in a corridor. Here she was just herself, and I realized I hadn't actually seen that before. She was visibly pregnant. Not at the stage where it would be visible to someone unfamiliar with Varenthi physiological indicators. Their pregnancy presents differently than human pregnancy, more internally, with fewer of the external markers humans associate with the condition. But I'd been briefed by then, because I'd done my research after getting her message, and I knew what to look for. There was a particular quality to how she moved, a slight recalibration in how she carried her own weight, subtle but present. And there was something about her hands, which she had been almost perfectly still in the Citadel, which here had a very faint quality of attention, of occasional unconscious awareness of her own center of gravity. She was somewhere past the halfway point, by my calculation. She was carrying the Kethvarel, the heir who continues, and she'd been doing it here, alone except for whoever she'd trusted enough to bring with her, for over a year. We sat down across from each other, and she asked me if I still had the recording. I said yes. She asked if I had listened to it. I said yes. She looked at me for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was almost grateful, I think, though it was a complicated, layered kind of gratitude, the kind that has earned its complexity through the difficulty of the situation that required it. She said, "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain I should," I said, "but I made a promise." "I know, I could tell." A pause. "I've been thinking about that corridor for 14 months. You were the only witness to the actual conversation. Everyone else who knows about that night knows the version that was managed afterward." "What version is that?" "That I left voluntarily due to irreconcilable policy disagreements, that it was mutual, that there was no declaration." I watched her face when she said that last word. She said it precisely, clinically, without flinching, but I'd heard the conversation. I knew what the declaration had been, and even in the clinical delivery I could see the shape of something it had cost her. "Why does the official version matter?" I asked. "If you've already left already." "Because of this," she said, and she made a gesture that included, with great economy, the space her body now occupied. I didn't say anything. She said, "His advisors will eventually discover the pregnancy. Information this significant doesn't stay contained indefinitely, and when they discover it, the official account of why I left will determine everything, how it's framed, who is seen as having agency, what obligations exist. If I left voluntarily due to policy disagreements, I am an ex-consort with no standing and no claim. If I was expelled, if there was a formal declaration, then under bloodline law, the expelling party has legal obligations that the declared party can invoke." She said it calmly, not as a threat, not as a legal argument being constructed on the fly. As a fact she had clearly already examined from every angle, over 14 months, in this small room on a remote station, with whatever advisors she'd trusted enough to bring with her. She'd been thinking about this the whole time. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "The recording," she said, "and your testimony, not now, not yet, but at the right time, at the time when it will matter." I stayed on Erethys 7 for 6 days. This was partly because the return transit connections were inconvenient and partly because, once we started talking, There were things that needed to be said that took time to say properly. We talked over those 6 days in a way that I don't have a clean category for. Not friendship exactly. We were too different, too separated by species and circumstance, and the particular weight of what she carried. Not a formal information exchange, either, though that was part of it. Something more like two people who had both been present at the same significant moment, and needed to compare what they'd witnessed from their different vantage points, and found in the comparison something neither of them had expected. She told me things I hadn't known. I told her things she'd suspected but not confirmed. And somewhere in the middle of that exchange, a picture formed that was larger than either of our individual perspectives. The thing I hadn't known was about the Veritine testimony that had started the fight. The one she'd given to the compact envoys without his authorization. She hadn't told me about it in the corridor, and I hadn't asked. There hadn't been time. But here, with time, she explained it. The testimony wasn't a strategic power play. It wasn't her reaching for influence she hadn't been granted. It was, and this is the part I've thought about more than anything else in the last 3 years, it was the right answer to the right question at the right time, given by a person who had spent 300 years learning to give those. The compact envoys had asked specifically about the environmental impact assessments for the Veritine deposits. They'd asked because there were concerns, well-documented concerns, apparently, that his side of the negotiation had been choosing not to raise, about the extraction methodology proposed by the Galactic Medical Consortium and its potential effect on the second moon's geological stability. The envoys had asked because they wanted to know if the Varenthi throne was aware of the risk and had chosen to proceed anyway, or if they were unaware. They'd asked Lyraneth because she had attended, on the previous day, a session with the Varenthi Environmental Council at which those concerns had been presented. She was, at that moment, the only person in the diplomatic setting who had been in both rooms, the only person with the complete picture. She'd answered because the answer was needed. Because not answering would have allowed negotiations to proceed on incomplete information, which would have been worse for everyone, including the Varenthi crown, in the long run. She'd referred them to the king because she knew it was his prerogative to act on the information. His chamberlain had said he was unavailable. She'd done what 300 years of political navigation had taught her to do. She'd filled the gap with competence and trusted that the broader context would be understood. He hadn't understood. Or, and this is the version I've come to believe, sitting with it for 3 years he had understood, and that was precisely the problem. He'd understood that she had been, in that room, exactly what she'd spent 300 years becoming, not an extension of his authority but an authority in her own right, someone who could operate without him, someone who didn't need his authorization to do the right thing. And that had frightened him. Not in the simple, ego-bruised way of someone whose territory has been encroached on. In the deeper, stranger way of someone who built everything around a certain order of things, a certain understanding of his own centrality, and suddenly saw very clearly that the world continued to function, correctly and competently, without him at the center of it. 4,087 years old, and that was what had finally unsettled him. She talked about the pregnancy differently than I expected, not reluctantly. She wasn't hiding from it, wasn't performing a kind of stoic indifference she didn't feel, but not sentimentally either, with the same particular clarity she brought to everything else, as a fact to be navigated, as a reality that existed independently of every other reality in her life and demanded its own specific kind of attention. She said, one evening when we were sitting in the station's observation lounge, a small room with a viewport that looked out on a region of space so dark and so distant from any significant light source that the stars were genuinely staggering, the kind of density that you don't get near inhabited systems, she said. I knew what the healer's notes meant. I had the same bloodline texts he does. I understood the word they used. Cathverl, I said. She looked at me, briefly surprised that I knew it. Yes, and I sat with that for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of knowing what I was carrying and not knowing how to tell him, because I had learned over 300 years to read him. And what I was reading in those 6 weeks was not a man who would receive that news with, she paused, looked for the right word, clarity. He was already in a particular place, a particular kind of rigidity that I had watched build over decades. And I thought, if I tell him now, if I tell him while he's in that place, the child becomes a tool, becomes a justification for whatever he wants to justify. And I wanted the child to be a child first. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dense field of stars. And then the night happened, and I thought, he's just told me what I am to him. He's just told me very clearly that what I am is an extension of his authority. And this child, she made that same small gesture again, the one that encompassed her own center. This child is not an extension of anything. This child is its own person, and it deserves a first year of existence that is not a political event. I didn't say anything. I'm not sure there was anything useful to say. She said, I'm not trying to take the air from him. I'm not trying to erase him from this child's life. What I am trying to do is give this child and myself a beginning that isn't defined by the throne room and the Declaration, and whatever legal and political machinery gets set in motion the moment the world finds out. And then it depends on him. She said it simply, not as a condition, not as a challenge, as a straightforward assessment of the actual state of things, and then it depends on him. On the 5th day, I asked her the question I'd been carrying for 14 months. I said, in the corridor, when you saw me, you could have just kept walking. Why did you tell me anything at all? She thought about it for a moment. Not long, she'd clearly thought about this too over the months. Because you looked frightened, she said, and embarrassed. And you had the expression of someone who knew they'd witnessed something significant and wasn't sure what to do with it. That's accurate, I admitted. And because I'd spent 6 weeks trying to figure out what to do with significant things, and I was very tired, and there was something, she paused, something relieving about another person knowing, even a stranger, even someone who had no business being there. The knowing was shared suddenly, and that made it more real, made it more permanent. You wanted a witness because a witness makes it real. I wanted a witness because witnesses are how history works, she said. The version that gets documented is the version that survives. He can tell his people whatever he wants about that night. His advisors can manage the communication, but you were in that corridor, and the recording exists, and now you know the rest. She looked at me steadily. The truth is fragile if only one person holds it, less fragile if 2 people hold it. Less fragile still the more people carry it. I nodded. I understood what she was asking me to do. Not in that moment, she'd said, not yet, not the right time, but eventually, when the moment came. I said, what happens if he doesn't come to find her? If he just doesn't? If pride is bigger than whatever he'd feel when he finds out? She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, 4,087 years is a very long time to have been alive. But it is not long enough to have learned everything, and there are things you don't learn except by loss. Another pause. He's going to lose things before this is finished, and one of 2 things happens when you lose things you didn't know you valued. You learn from the loss, or you don't. Which do you think it'll be? She looked back out at the stars. I think, she said, that the thrumline activated at a 7 when he said those words. I think the building knew, even if he didn't. And I think 4,000 years of history is not nothing. She didn't answer the question directly, but I think, in her way, she had.